In our last episode, the raven landed in the land of Medora, a land gripped by an unseen evil force. He happened upon a chipmunk named Halmela and had just formally introduced himself to Halmela as the Watcher.
The Watcher? That is fairly vague. I am also watching you watch me. Yet I would answer if you inquire that I am Halmela. Now you see, that is a name, not just an abstract title. So do you have an actual name, Raven? She inquired.
A very long time ago, yes. Perhaps I did have a name. At least there was a sound that was synonymous with my being. However, that particular sound, very long and very complex, infinitely so, in fact. So it would take quite a long time to repeat in the here and now. Also, you would have to be quite adept at listening to even hear most of it. So again, I implore you, my dear, to simply refer to me as the Watcher. Now, he continued, I know now that you are called Halmela, but I do not know anything about you. And you know that I am called the Watcher. And yet you also know nothing about me. I would quite like to remedy our predicament in a hasty fashion. Yet there's a matter of great interest to me. The raven paused and gestured with his wing toward the graveyard of trees they stood in. I have a very keen interest in how these trees were ripped out of the ground, and I perceive that you hold the answer. Is that the case? He asked. His eyes locked with Halmela with a supernatural intensity. She could feel his gaze pull her in. His eyes seemed to bore deep within, seeing into the misty haze that lay at the center of her consciousness. Finally, after quite a long moment, she broke his gaze and averted her eyes. She wondered what might have happened had she not done so. She felt as if she had been about to slip out of the world, like a wisp of fog being blown by the evening breeze. After many moments, she nodded and replied,
Yes, I can answer all your questions about this graveyard. All these trees were felled in a horrendous storm just over 12 years ago. I only faintly remember the night in question, as I was still a babe, but my mother spoke of the night in vivid detail.
Excellent, cried the raven. I would be delighted to speak with her. Halmela frowned, a deep pang of grief rushing through like a freezing river.
As would I, she mumbled bitterly.
The raven frowned instantly, determining the cause of the pain in the elderly chipmunk's face. I am deeply sorry. How long ago did she pass from this realm? He asked.
Just over 9 winters past, she replied. I was still quite young. I'm not really sure exactly what happened, but it most certainly was related to her foray into the Foul Grove.
Foul Grove? What exactly do you mean? Asked the raven.
If you were to travel west for 2 days, there's an old scraggly snake tree. It sits by a small stream. If you cross that stream and go through the grove of sycamore trees, you'll come to a bramble thicket. The leaves of the brambles are quite menacing, a sickly dark green, and they're coated in an oily, foul-smelling substance that burns the flesh with a fire that feels as if it were made of ice. The thorns are harder than stone and sharper than an eagle's talons. They're also massive, much longer than your beak. If they so much as prick you, it is more agonizing than a hornet sting. Just beyond the brambles is a patch of trees that are blacker than the blackest nights. They are rotting and decaying, yet somehow they still grow. They speak a form of speech unlike normal trees. Their voices fill you with dismay. And there seems to be a second putrid voice that is just out of earshot behind their words. It is truly a horrible place, the worst by far I have ever seen.
Halmela paused and shivered slightly. Just the thought of the foul grove made her feel ill, and thinking of her mother made the wound of her loss twinge and ache. A single tear rolled down her cheek, and she took a shaky breath and swallowed down the geyser of emotions before they bubbled over. The raven noted her anguish, but remained silent. He did not push or prod, but simply sat stoically as he contemplated her words. He saw the chipmunk give one last gentle shudder as she rustled a sob down somewhere deep within herself and looked back up at the raven. Her eyes were once again dry, and she continued with a hint of tears within her voice.
My mother was gathering food for the winter when she came upon a badger. In her escape from the beast, she became disoriented and did not realize where she was. Typically, we made quite a large berth around the area, trying to never come close to the foul grove. However, as my mother roamed about, she saw the hateful leaves and smelled their horrible sap. She was then taken by a spell of foolishness. As she stared at the brambles, she was filled with a horrible fascination about this place. All of these years, she had simply thought of it as an oddity, a place to simply be forgotten and avoided. But in that moment, she could not prevent herself from wondering about the mystery of the place. It had been here for longer than anyone could say. Even her grandmother had never known a world without the foul grove. A deep compulsion then struck my mother. She simply had to know what lay on the other side. A silent voice called to her, a noiseless thought. The world seemed to stretch itself out, the horrid trees looming taller than the sky. There was no escape. She must enter the grove. Rationally, she knew it was a foolish endeavor, but the dark side of her mind could not resist the sick fascination. So she made her way over to the brambles. She then carefully weaved her way through, taking great care not to touch any part of the disgusting plants. When she had successfully made her way through, she took in the scene in front of her. A gentle slope that crested in a ridge above a small valley lay before her, full of thick black trees, pulsating and excreting an even fouler ooze than that of the brambles. Their ghastly limbs entwined themselves around each other like dancing serpents, forming a thick, impenetrable canopy despite the trees being gangly and sparse. More brambles haphazardly scattered themselves around. There was a horrible smell of sulfur and rotting carcasses that was almost thick enough to gather with a spoon. The dark and dank dimness created deep crevices of abyss, and the shadows seemed to reach out with long claw-like fingers. Whispers from an unspeakable language were spoken in a hiss from unseen voices. The ooze from the trees had puddled in places around the roots, and within them there dwelt tiny, tortured things that moaned and shrieked. There was no wind, yet the trees still rustled and seemed to turn to look at my mother with their ugly gazes. Within moments, her curiosity turned to terror, the grove turning in a flash from mystery to nightmare. There are no words to describe the horridness of that place. It is beyond evil. My mother scurried quickly back towards where she had come, but the distance seemed to twist itself, distending and stretching out further and further away as she fled towards it. The faster she ran, the further it seemed. She ran until her lungs were ready to burst. Eventually, she stopped, her chest heaving and her breath coming in shallow bursts, full of the revolting stench. She looked up and saw that she was nowhere near the bramble thicket. The ridge and valley were also no longer anywhere to be seen. She looked around furiously, beyond panic, past even hysteria. Her heart was going to explode at any moment. She closed her eyes and heard an oily voice laugh quietly, full of malice. and it was sickly sweet, like a glass of poisoned mead. She buried her head in her hands and screamed. She said that the stars themselves must have surely heard it. She screamed until her voice was in tatters. She curled up and cried and begged to be able to leave and return to me. Eventually, after what felt like a lifetime, there was no more voice left. Not a single tear left to fall. And still she sat waiting for some instance of pain or violence. Yet it never came. After some considerable time, she felt she had the strength to open her eyes. She tentatively allowed the world to gently slip in through a tiny crack in her eyelids. She saw no twisted beasts or maniacal demons waiting to see her eyes before they sunk their depraved teeth into her. She opened her eyes another hair and still saw nothing horrible waiting in the shadows. So she pulled her eyes open all the way and saw that it was now solidly night. Judging by the positions of the heavenly elements, she guessed it was close to 3 a.m. She was on a ridge above a small lake, and she could see the majestic sky reflecting on the glassy surface. She looked out, impressed with just how beautiful this scene was, especially considering what her eyes had seen before they had been closed. She sat pensively for a while by the lake and listened to the familiar forest sounds. An owl hooted from somewhere far away. After several long and heavy moments, she made her way down a small path to the lakeshore to have a drink. As she made her way down the small trail, she saw an old stump covered in moss that could masquerade as a cloak of emeralds. Suddenly, her mind was flooded with memory. It had been many long winters past, but this was once her and my father's favorite spot. She had not been here since well before my birth, but the spot was unmistakable as she realized. Thousands of memories came rushing back as she remembered the countless hours she had spent there. More importantly, she knew now which direction home was. It was quite a journey, roughly a week, but she was no longer lost. And so at dawn she set out. The journey was largely unremarkable. Only a handful of encounters with songbirds and frogs. Nothing perilous. She did notice that she grew wary faster than she felt she should, but she wrote that off, assuming the series of incredible experiences had sapped her stamina, and once she could rest, all would be well. Eventually, she found her way back to our den. At this point, she had been missing almost a fortnight, and I'd gone delirious with worry. So you can imagine how flooded with relief I was to lay my eyes upon my sweet mother's face again. She beguiled me with her monumental tale, enrapturing me for hours. I was still young, just barely a maiden, and her tale was so outlandish, I was almost envious of her adventure. We spent much of that first day speculating how she possibly could have awoken almost 20 miles from the Foul Grove, with neither of us being able to successfully conjure a satisfying answer. I begged her to show me the lake she spoke of. She smiled softly and assured me that come spring we would make our way there and frolic merrily in the waters. Unfortunately, these feelings of goodwill proved to be quite short-lived. For you see, the tendency to grow weary that my mother noticed on her journey home continued to grow worse. Her strength seemed as if it had left, and she was waning just as the moon. Within a few weeks, she was gone.
Halmela took a deep breath. She had been speaking rapidly, the words spilling like a waterfall. She had never before spoken of her mother's death. She had never been able to face the pain. She felt raw and open after dredging up all these long forgotten emotions. But it also felt strangely nice. The pain was not nearly as unbearable as she had imagined it would be. Suddenly, she had a suspicion, and she stared at the raven edging away slightly.
What strange magic have you placed upon me? She demanded. I have never spoken about this with anyone before, not even a whisper. Yet I've just told you everything. All the thoughts I have kept hidden. Release me from this glamour you have cast upon me, she exclaimed, the hair on her neck standing up.
And the raven surveyed her curiously. Her outburst of anger was surprising but understandable. Obviously, the chipmunk was emotionally frazzled. He had alighted upon her, given her a fright, and befuddled her, and now has opened deep wounds that had not properly healed. The raven could understand her mistrust, for it had become abundantly clear that this land was tainted with dark magic, like a pestilence that was brooding in the dark. The raven attempted to comfort Halmela. My dear, I have not cast any magics or glamours upon you. I am simply rather adept at listening. And the curious thing about listening is that you're always open to the exterior. You become engulfed entirely in the world that surrounds you. And it becomes quite easy to determine then, from another's perspective, that there's no judgment and no cause for fear. When speaking the truth, the story you have told me has been churning like a tempest in your heart, banging at the door, trying to escape. You have been secretly yearning to unearth the well of emotions you've buried far below. For your mind knows it must address them. Your heart needed to trust, and it determined that I was trustworthy. And that is why you decided to let loose and open yourself up. My mother considered this. She still felt distrustful, but she could not deny the truth of the raven's words. She had been terrified of confronting her grief, and she was relieved to have expressed those locked-away feelings. She took a deep breath and looked up at the raven, just as before. For seemingly no reason, she decided to trust the strange bird. A long moment of quiet passed between them. In the distance, far beyond the graveyard of trees, the sounds of the early morn could be heard as the birds began to chirp and the woodland creature stirred. The sun hinted at its arrival with a faint misty glow along the horizon. The velvety midnight blue sky suddenly beginning to pale. The moon still hung in the air, its brilliant sheen beginning to dull. The silence between the raven and Halmela spoke volumes. The things unsaid between them as they sat in silence said far more than any word that could be uttered. The quiet companionship was a wonderful feeling for Halmela. She had lived in quiet for quite a long time. She had grown to appreciate it, to actually revel in the solitude it afforded. Yet she had completely forgotten the feeling of another close by, radiating security and compassion. And the raven seemed to, in a way, absorb some of the weight that grief had set upon her. The load seemed to grow steadily lighter and lighter, and by the time the sun had fully peeked out from below the line of trees and turned the sky into a spectacular mosaic of oranges, pinks, lavender, and dusty blue, swirled with divine grace into fluffy clouds, and that promised a heavenly day, and she felt considerably lighter than she could ever remember. As the warm glow of the morning sun touched her face, Halmela broke the long silence, thus ending the surreal spell.
You asked to know the nature of how these trees were felled, she stated plainly.
Yes, as I said, I am keenly interested in how these fellows met their fate. How long ago did they fall? Asked the raven.
It was around early spring, roughly 12 years ago. I cannot remember the exact day, but it was sometime close to the second moon. It had been remarkably warm that winter. There was no snow at all, and rarely was there ever frost upon the grass. The trees had been perturbed. None of them had a memory of a winter so mild. Many of the younger trees grew confused and bloomed much too early, and everything was amiss. Constantly, there was a feeling of building pressure, and even as the forest basked in the unforeseen warmth, everything was aware that this warmth was unnatural and could not bode well. One day, the sun rose, and the temperature was astoundingly warm. It could have passed as a summer day. The air was heavy and clung to you like wet wool. Menacing, sickly green and purple-tinted clouds hung in the air all day, leering down upon the earth, moving like bloated grubs across the sky. My mother spoke of a foul odor akin to burning hair that seemed to be everywhere that day, even by the stream. As the day wore on, the temperature rose and rose, and the clouds grew so thick that it seemed to be dusk at midday. My mother said that she did not even see the sun at all during the day. A foul sense of dread accompanied the clouds. They had a menacing aura that seemed to taunt, like demons from the murky depths. Hardly a sound was made all day, only the murmurs of the trees as they fretted over the meaning of these omens. Sometime in the latter part of the evening, a dark, mutated purple cloud formed a typhoon in the western sky, near where the foul grove lies. It churned like an angry serpent, and the wind began to build and build. Sheets of rain came down in bursts with intense velocity, striking the land like whips. The trees began to sway back and forth as the gale swirled around. In the distance, thunder boomed, shaking the ground, even though its pitch was so low the ear could barely perceive it. Lightning lit up the horizon, making the silhouette of the trees flash. They looked like skeletal fingers stretching out for the heavens. The sky continued to darken until the world was encased in a dense, velvety blackness. The typhoon churned ever faster. The rain reached a point where it was being whipped so violently by the wind that it pierced your flesh like small shards of glass. Every creature cowered in terror. Even the bears and the wolves felt fear, something that was most unusual for the fiercest warriors of the forest. The trees groaned in agony and cried out in terror, their limbs slowly being ripped away, their leaves blowing in the wind like snowflakes. The storm continued to build and build until finally the floods were released. There was a massive bolt of lightning. It was so bright that it could have melted your eyes to look directly at it. It was accompanied by a thunderclap that shook the foundations of the earth. Its booming voice was terrifying. It sounded as if an army of angry giant horses above was puddling up. The lower areas flooded completely. The topsoil and forest debris was washed away, exposing the roots of the trees. Many creatures fled their dens as they filled with water. As the wind reached a fever pitch, the weaker trees finally succumbed to its might. There was a deafening roar as the first tree trunk shattered, the crown crashing to the ground. Then another, this one even more, then another, and another. Trees began to fall like soldiers in battle. There were screams of terror, agonized moans, and streams of tears that rivaled the rain. The mighty titans who had forged this wood were being felled like saplings. After what felt like an age, but was probably less than an hour, the storm relented slightly, dropping from a world-ending gale to simply a generational storm. The tension in the air began to release as survivors prepared to survey the damage and begin their recovery. However, the storm was not finished. It was merely pausing slightly. Instead of faltering and dying away, the energy of the storm seemed to be refreshed. The wind turned faster again, except this time it seemed to be thirsty for blood. The wind turned and turned and turned, and the lightning began to strike the ground over and over, as if seeking vengeance for some heinous offense. And the thunder began to crescendo. Its symphony was deafening. The typhoon swelled and descended upon the land like a plague. It pulled the mighty trees that were older than could be counted out of the ground like weeds and threw them like twigs hundreds of miles away. It churned the land into mud, decimating all things alive. It raged and tore apart the land like a foul beast tearing into a fresh kill. It seemed to have a malevolent drive to seek the most destruction possible. And it was certainly successful. Hours later, when the storm finally began to recede, there was absolutely nothing remaining in its path but churned mud mixed with the blood and tears of all who had once called this place home.
As Halmela concluded her story, the raven gently nodded his head. Her words were perturbing, for he knew that the storm she described could not be a normal storm. It must have had assistance, and he could only think of one entity who could be the culprit. It was abundantly clear now, without a doubt, that this land was indeed precisely where he needed to be.